We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians 11 divides itself pretty readily into two different subjects. One that we can use this morning in a twisted way to talk about fathers, but at least we'll get some fathers into it. And then next week we'll be talking about the Lord's Supper. So these are two more questions that Paul has received from the congregation in Corinth, and he's trying to do some teaching and some correction to get them where they need to be in their worship services. In fact, all the way from chapter 11 through chapter 14, there's all kinds of different questions that Paul is addressing having to do with worship. The first one is how a person ought to present themselves for worship. In our culture, this is an interesting, strange kind of question, but we'll take a quick look at it and see what kind of applications we might be able to make. Chapter 11 and verse 1, follow my example, as I also follow the example of Christ. I praise you for remembering me in everything, and for holding to the traditions, just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man. The head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace for him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about that, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. Is that odd? It is. The 21st century church looks at this, and it is definitely an oddity to us, because our cultures are so vastly different than what Paul had. However, there are some things that we can glean from the text that I think will be useful to us. And the first of them is, I think it's important Paul begins with, I want you to follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding on to the traditions just as I have passed them on to you. Now, he gives them some praise and some encouragement, and then the word but shows up, and he starts talking to them about some things he'd like for them to change. Go down to verse 17. I want to show you something real quick. When we get there next week, he doesn't give them any praise to start this section. He says, in the following directives, I have no praise for you, because your meetings do more harm than good. So he starts this section with, I appreciate the way that you follow the things that I've given you. The traditions are still being upheld, but I have some things you need to correct. By the time he gets to the Lord's Supper, he says, I got nothing good to say. We need to just talk about the problems that are there. But that's for next week. You only have to take slightly out of context to preach a good sermon on male spiritual leadership. Paul says, follow me because I'm following Christ. If the men in our families, if the fathers in our families are following Christ, then the women have something to follow. The children have something to follow. If the men in our families are not following Christ, if they're not leading their families in Christian ways, then what do the families have to follow? Reminds me a little bit of Joshua. Joshua takes over for Moses. He gets the people ready to go into the land of Canaan. And he says, I need you guys to make a choice. You see, we're going to go into a land where there's lots of other gods being worshipped. And you could make that choice. You could decide that you wanted to follow after those gods. We left behind in Egypt a bunch of gods that people still worship and serve. And you could still worship and serve those gods. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. So he makes a stand as the leader of his own family, and it's a trickle down. Right? I'm going to serve the Lord. My family's going to serve the Lord. And I think that all of you as a nation of Israel under my influence ought also to worship the Lord. I don't think there was a vote taken that day, do you? Joshua says, as for me and my family, we will worship the Lord. Kind of meant, all of you guys do too. Now let's go and take the land that God has so graciously given us. We need strong male leadership in areas that will last beyond this world and that will expand beyond our family groups. I bet some of you had a male role model in your growing up that was not your daddy, was not your biological father, but was connected to the Lord. And he helped you to understand what it meant to be a Christian. He helped you understand what it meant to be in Christ because he was. So Paul says, I've given you an example, and I appreciate the fact that you're following my example. Unfortunately, they do have some problems. And Paul, because he knows that they care about him and care about the things that he's been teaching them, has the right now to say, but there are some things that we need to address. He sees some things in Corinth that bother him. There was a guy named Chloe that had written Paul a letter. And Paul is answering a bunch of questions and responding to a lot of things that Chloe had told him. And I'm sure this is one of those things that Chloe had noticed that some things were going on in the worship setting that he thought Paul should address. So he makes some arguments concerning prayer and prophecy, and particularly the women who are doing prayer and prophecy in those early assemblies. So he's going to make some arguments from their own setting. They're a little different, a little difficult for us, but I think we can gather something from them. Here's Paul's arguments for head coverings in worship. He starts out clearly enough, talking about general authority. You have a wife and the children being led by a husband or a father. Now, in Paul's growing up, and probably in yours as well, there was a turnover time for the women between being their father's little girl and being somebody's wife. We have a small section in weddings that we usually do, right? Somebody walks the bride down the aisle, and the preacher says something like, who comes giving this woman in marriage? And a lot of times the answer is, her mother and I, right? The father has walked her down the aisle to give her away. So we make that transition from I'm under the authority of my father to I'm under the authority of my husband. We still do that in our culture, so that's not too difficult for us. But the father then has the responsibility to be led by Christ. Right? As the wife and the children are led by the father then must be led by Christ. Here's an interesting little something you can stick in the back of your mind. Since we are the bride of Christ as the church, and we as male leaders in our families are also part of the bride of Christ, then we also, as this feminine descriptor, this bride, are subject to Christ as our husband. So we have all kinds of levels that this is working on. But the father has the responsibility to be led by Christ as he is leading his wife and children. And then Christ has shown his willingness to be obedient to the Father. So wives must be obedient to the husband, who is obedient to Christ, who is obedient to the Father. But then Paul starts applying these spiritual truths in physical ways. And that's where this passage gets difficult for us. Right? I have no problem with the spiritual setting in which Paul puts this, but the physical setting is a little bit different. So it's important to remember that as time marches on, physical things don't always mean the same thing. In different cultures and different times, things mean different things. For example, in the Old Testament, tattoos were forbidden because tattoos were what people did to connect themselves to false gods. So when they came into Canaan, they were forbidden from getting tattoos because it would seem as if they were dedicating themselves to some local god. So they didn't do that. My personal experience, the first time I was in Alva, 2000 to 2006, my college students, hardly anybody had a tattoo. Still mainly male, mainly rough guys. When we got back to Alva in 2013, lots and lots of people had tattoos. Lots of girls had tattoos. Lots of girls were heavily painted, right? Lots of tats. And not a one of them, to my knowledge, got those tattoos to say, I'm in league with a god or I'm in league with a demon. It was just, it's body paint. It's not my thing. I don't want it. I'm a little bit of a wimp. It seems like it might hurt. I'm not up for it. However, the culture has shifted so much that when you see somebody with body art, your first impression should not be that person is evil or that person has a problem spiritually. It's just a way of expressing themselves, or whatever psychosis it takes to let somebody do that to you. All right. So, when Paul starts talking about the women in Corinth needing to cover their heads while the men are uncovered, there are some things behind that we might need to know. There's two reasonable explanations. One you've probably heard before, one you may not have. The first one is that Roman men covered their heads while they were praying to their idols. In fact, even the Caesar, he was the Pontifex Maximus. What does that mean? He was the head priest. He was the high priest of Roman religion. And so as the high priest of Roman religion, there are lots of ancient coins, lots of ancient inscriptions that show the Caesar with his toga pulled up over his head in prayer. When men went to prayer for a lot of these Roman gods, they would pull their robes up over their head. So it's very possible that what Paul is saying to the men is, you shouldn't do that because people will look at you and think that you're praying to a false god. There are also lots of references to brothels in which men grew their hair long while women went around uncovered. They didn't wear a head covering, and many of the women shaved their heads. So you've got Paul saying to the women, if you're not going to wear a head covering when you pray, you might as well shave your head. If you are assumed to be like those women, then you might as well go the whole way and say, yeah, that's me, and just shave it all off. In our culture, at this point in our history, there's just not much hair references that are in this category. There's not many ways that a woman can wear her hair that show that she's in rebellion, or that certainly not that she's a prostitute. Right? A man with long hair, we don't immediately say that guy's a prostitute. A woman with short hair, we don't immediately say that woman must be working at the brothel. It has nothing to do with the way we view people in our society. So we have to remember that back in chapter 10 and 9, some of the last questions that Paul was answering had to do with, can we eat meat that's been offered to idols? Is it okay for us to go up to the feast if there's a feast at the idol's temple? Is that okay? So they were already in this, how do we separate what we're doing in worship from what they were doing in worship? And so it seems that maybe Paul comes down on the side of, don't look like you're worshiping what they're worshiping. Be different in the way that you present yourselves in worship. The temple of Aphrodite boasted one of the best brothels in town. Don't look like those people, because people will think that you are those people, and you're trying to carry the image of Christ so that others will want to come to know Him. Now, I will add one quick snippet that I should probably leave alone, but I won't. Gender swappers and homosexuals aren't doing anything they haven't always done. Right? This is, you go back to creation. It's always been there. They're just louder, and they have social media now. So they're not hiding anything from anybody. But if you will notice, there is a certain kind of hairstyle that is prevalent among them. And that hairstyle is meant to say, look at me, I'm not you. So it's still there, it's still in our culture, but it's not as prevalent perhaps as it was at Corinth. I would also throw in a song from the 1960s, sign, everywhere a sign, blocking out the scenery, breaking my mind. You remember the part about the sign said, long-haired hippie people need not apply. So I stuck my hair up under my hat and I went in to ask him why. He said, you look like a fine, upstanding young man. I guess you'll do. And I took off my hat and said, imagine that, me working for you. So there was a time that long hair was a way of saying, I'm not you. Right? I'm different. We're changing the world because we're different, and we're going to show our differentness by the way we wear our hair. But in our culture in 2024, I don't know that there's very many equivalents for this. So Paul gives some non-cultural explanations. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, if you will. Paul says the reason that women ought to have a sign of authority on their head is because men were created first, and that men were created in the image of God. Women were created second, and women were created in the image of man. That's an obscure little passage that sits over there by itself. Women, have you ever thought of yourselves in that way? It's an interesting thought. When we talk about human beings, we say human beings are created in the image of God. When Paul thinks about men and women, he makes a separation. He says men are created in the image of God, and that women are created in the image of man, referring back to Adam and Eve. So let's look at a couple of passages real quick, and I'll just leave that with you. Chapter 1, verse 27, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Who did he create in his image? Male and female. Right? Okay. So you go into chapter 2, verse 7. The Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living spirit. Skip over to 20. As for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs. He closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. And the man said, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman, because she was taken out of man. And that's why a man leaves his father and his mother, and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, but they felt no shame. So Paul kind of leaves chapter 1 to the side and concentrates on chapter 2. God creates Adam, breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and then takes from Adam's rib and makes woman. It's a little more specific, perhaps, than chapter 1 fills in some of the blanks. But then Paul mentions the angels. Women need a sign of authority on their head because the angels are watching. He must be referring to Genesis 6, where the sons of God took the daughters of men as their wives. But again, it's an obscure passage. There are questions that I can't answer, but here's some suggestions. Angels have to be interested in human worship. We're interested in angelic worship, right? When you read over in Revelation and you see that the angels are singing holy, 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 and you thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000 angels in vast array are singing in the heaven. That's interesting to me. I'd like to see it in person. Hope I get to see it in person someday. do the angels think about our worship? Do they like to peek? Do they hang around when we're worshiping? Are there angels anywhere close to us now who want to know what we're doing in our worship? I don't know. But either he's talking about angels wanting to know about human worship, or he's talking about angels wanting human women for their own. Either way, he says, the women need to be covered, either to show them that they're serious about their worship, or to show them that they're serious about their relationship with human men. Odd. Paul writes some odd things. If you read in 2 Peter, Peter tells us that our brother Paul writes some things that are difficult to understand. For me, this is one of them. And so finally, he says, nature is watching. Right? The angels are watching. Nature is watching. He says, doesn't nature show you that long hair on a man is a disgrace? Does nature show us that? Does nature not show us that long hair on a woman is her glory? It's probably less obvious than Paul might have thought. I wonder what Paul would think about our hairstyles in 2024. But I've not met, particularly a woman in church. I've never met a woman in church, whether her hair was long or whether her hair was short, that made me think that woman's not in subjection to her husband because of her hair. Never. Anybody? Do you head this way? I know you haven't. There's not an equivalent. There's not an equivalent having to do with, like wearing the burqa, covering the head, surrounding oneself, covering the face. None of that in Western culture says anything about a woman and her worship. So at some point you have to say, Paul, we get the point. You want males to be the spiritual leaders in their families. Paul, we get the point. Women need to follow the leadership of those strong spiritual males in their family. But how do we show it? How can women let the world know that that's who they are? If it's not about covering or not covering their head. Oh, and by the way, when I was a kid, there was still, this has always been an interesting passage, but there was a question about it. And some of the women started wearing hats to church. Now, if you worship in an African-American church, you probably will still see hats. But they're not necessarily coverings to say, okay, I'm praying and prophesying with my head covered. They're probably a style statement. I spoke in a predominantly African-American congregation in Florida one time, and the hats were amazing. I mean, there was absolutely beautiful array of chapeaus in the place. But it wasn't about, we're doing this for spiritual reasons. It was about, we like hats, and it's a trend. Early in the 60s, in Anglo churches of Christ, there were little hats that kept showing up. Did any of you girls ever wear a pillbox hat? Yeah, you did. Okay, so if you remember when Mrs. Kennedy started wearing the little pillbox hats, right? And women wore pillbox hats to church. If you don't know what that is, look it up. You'll love it. These little things that they wore on their heads to church. Was it about spirituality? Was it a head covering so that we'll be right before? No, it was a fashion. And women were wearing that fashion, and so they wore them to church. I just don't think there's anything head covering-wise that is the right answer to the question. So is there any way for a woman to show that she is connected and under the leadership of her husband, who is following Christ, who is subject to the Father, to make this pyramid work? Having said all that, I'm going to start with this. Maybe it is a head covering. Any of you have friends who are in movements where the women wear head coverings? Not just in worship, but regularly. We don't have as many that live in our neighborhood. Where we lived in Alva, there were lots of folks who wore head coverings. They were very demure. They were certainly not hats. They were certainly not stylish. You could kind of tell what group they were with by the color. There was a light blue color that was worn by several, a white color that was worn by others. But when you saw one of them, it was usually accompanied by long hair. So you have a head covering and then you have long hair as well. But what were they telling the people at Walmart? I'm a member of this religious group. And I'm wearing my hair this way because I'm in subjection to God, I'm in subjection to Christ, I'm in subjection to my husband. So we should honor people who have that compulsion. We should love people who have that compulsion. It's certainly not a wrong thing to do if that is the way they want to express their love and their submission to the Father, the Son, and their husband. But it's still not universal enough. Because the women who wear the little coverings are not accompanied by men who necessarily do not. You don't look at the man and go, okay, he's dedicated to God because he doesn't have a hat on. The only things that I can come up with that might be the same would possibly be jewelry. Does a woman wear a ring? I know that when I was single, that was important. Guys that are not, do you remember when you were? And you would walk up and you'd start talking to a girl and you would kind of be glancing, right? Is there anything on that left hand? And the question would be, does she have a solitaire on? Is she maybe engaged? And guys who were not as good a person as me would look to see how big the solitaire was. Maybe I can beat it. Maybe I can still win this one back over. Or if you see a wedding band. If you've never talked to a woman and had her eventually go like that, then you're not me. Because I've had that happen more than one occasion. Because when I was a kid, I was wanting to find somebody. And the somebodies that I kept finding had already been found. And so they'd shake you the finger, they'd say, look. So that may be one way of saying, I have someone and I'm dedicated to them. It doesn't say I'm dedicated to someone who is dedicated to Christ, who is dedicated to the Father. Peter says that a woman can show her love for her husband and her love for God by the way she lives. He says, don't let your reputation be your outward adorning. Right? Wearing gold and jewels, the plaiting of the hair. But let it be of a quiet and meek spirit. So that's the way Sarah was, the way Sarah treated Abraham. That would be a good place for you. You could treat your husband with respect in the Lord, and perhaps that is something that could be done. Okay, here's the perfect way of doing it. Follow your husband to worship. Sit with your husband and worship. Sing, pray, worship with your husband. Which brings us back to the beginning of this rather winding sermon. Husbands, if you're not spiritually leading your family, how are they going to spiritually follow you? If your wife does not have a covering for her head, if she does not have a man that she is dedicated to, who is also dedicated to Christ, who is dedicated to God, how does any of this work? She's left floundering out there by herself. You would never for a moment consider not housing her, not making sure that she has the clothing that she needs, that she's well fed, that she's well loved in the physical sense. Why would you assume that the right thing to do is to leave her floundering in her spiritual walk as she tries to come before God? Be the man that God needs you to be so that your wife can be the woman that He has called her to be. The woman gives herself to her husband, who has given himself, along with his wife, to Christ, who has given himself to God. That's the way that it has to work. And Paul ends by saying, well, if anybody has any other problems with this, we got nothing else. This is what we teach everywhere. This is the answer to the question, wife, do you want to be faithful? Follow your husband who is being faithful. Husbands, if you want your wives to be faithful, then lead. So I'll end with this. Happy Father's Day. Now father up.